Well, welcome everybody. I'm William Sieghart. I'm the founder of the Forward Prizes for Poetry and National Poetry Day, and I'm here to chat to Anthony and Ben Holden, who have assembled this wonderful anthology, Poems That Make Grown Men Cry. So we're going to talk a little bit about the assembly of the anthology, but let's begin with poetry and how we all got into poetry and what it means for us, because as we're within the Being a Man festival, I can remember as I grew up, the idea of being keen on poetry was not part of being a man culturally, but what these two have brilliantly done is actually prove what I've always felt, actually, that poetry is part of being a human being, and it's not something to be shy about or embarrassed about, although it's something about our Anglo-Saxon culture here which makes us surprisingly reticent at being too public about our love affair with poetry. I think our Celtic cousins, if we were across the water in Dublin, if I wandered into a pub and belted out a poem, I might get bought a drink or two, and a few more would come out as a result. If I did it in a pub, I might find myself in London, people might think I'm probably getting in the way or being a nuisance or something like that. It doesn't quite have that same ease, poetry, in the Anglo-Saxon culture. And yet when you knock on the door of people's lives, you find that actually poetry is much, much loved and part of most people's psyches. I do readings and things, and I often go into working with people suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's. And the extraordinary thing is, it's like entering a room where people aren't really physically there. It's like that Larkin poem, The Old Fools. It's very, very disturbing. And then you start reciting poems that they learnt as a child, because that generation learnt a lot of poetry as a child, and instantly the room becomes awake. And it's as though they're all there. They're all reconnected to life. So poetry can have an extraordinary resonance, I think, for all of us. And I, for my sins, have last year did a tour of the nation's libraries, and I did a poetry pharmacy in each one. And a poetry pharmacy came about quite by chance, really. I made an anthology with Faber a couple of years ago, and as you know, once a book is out, you have to go around on this sort of route to promote it, and you visit lots of literary festivals and talk about your books and everything else. And a friend of mine came up with this idea that after my talk, I would retire to a quiet room, and people would come and tell me their worries, and I'd prescribe them a poem. And I thought this would be a sort of little 1 hour gimmick. And 6.5 hours later, and still with a very full bladder, I was still in my seat with a long queue of people snaking outside the tent who wanted to come and see me. And last year I must have done this with 500-600 people as I travelled through the library network of England, and it was gripping. So interesting to see, actually, how powerful poetry can be as a help. And I think it's because poetry can give you a complicity with how you feel, but don't necessarily have the language to express yourself. A good example of this would be probably the most common worry or concern that came my way last year was loneliness. And it intrigued me that in this very modern world, where we have so many ways of communicating with each other, how lonely we've become. And what actually was also intriguing was how social media is making us lonelier. And why? Because in some ways we put not ourselves on social media, but almost an avatar of ourselves, a kind of sense of who we'd like to be seen to be, but not the true, real me. And so for those who are already feeling a little bit lonely and friendless, the sight on social media of everybody's friends, likes, holidays, all these kinds of things actually exacerbates the loneliness. And I found 2 lines of poetry written 800 years ago by Hafez, a Persian poet, who wrote about the same time as Chaucer. And he said, "I wish I could show you, when you're lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being." Just that couplet. And I found giving that on a piece of paper to people to take away, they left from their chair a foot taller. And I had this wonderful email from somebody, wonderful in a way, but saying to me, "You won't remember me, but last year in Leeds or somewhere you gave me that poem and you told me to stick it on my mirror and learn it off by heart. And when I got home last night, my flat had been burgled and ransacked." And in that way that happens when burglars get into your house, everything was in turmoil, everything was everywhere. And the only thing that hadn't been disturbed was that poem on my mirror. And it got me through the night. Mm. And I think in a way that said it all for me, the potential power of poetry. That's my intro. 3 or so years ago, I got a phone call from a friend saying, would I meet with Anthony and Ben to talk about an idea they had? And the idea was just this. And was it 3 years ago? It feels like maybe it was a bit longer. And it was, at that stage, just an idea, wasn't it? And you talked to a few people, and you talked to a publisher. And extraordinarily, after the National Theatre, touring the country, all over the place, this wonderful book has really taken off. And have you any idea, Anthony, how many copies have been sold?
I think it was 30,000 hardback.
Hardback.
Which is a lot these days.
And we're now in paperback.
And for poetry, as you know, to get into the Sunday Times bestseller list at number 2 for 6 weeks is a pretty rare event too.
It's remarkable. So when you grew up, how did poetry come into your life, and why did it matter so much for you?
Well, I was very well taught at very good schools, and I read English at university, and poetry's always meant a great deal to me. And in fact, how this book came about is it was one of the people who taught me poetry, a very long-standing family friend, rang up one evening, it was about 20 years ago, and he'd had a domestic crisis. He'd had to section his wife. He'd had to shove her into the back of an ambulance, and he was very distressed. Why he rang me is the enigma, why he's got children. But anyway, I said, we'll be right up and take you out to dinner. And we went to Hampstead, took him out to dinner. And during dinner, we just let him pour it all out. And towards the end of dinner, this man, who, when I was his pupil, it was rather unfashionable then to say that Thomas Hardy is an even better poet than he is a novelist. Now it's more orthodox. But he started quoting a well-known Hardy poem, The Duckling Thrush. Man standing in a graveyard at dusk, why is that bird singing? It's not for me, is it singing for itself? And it ends on these lines about hope, some blessed hope of which he knows and I am unaware. And my friend choked up while speaking these lines because he wasn't feeling much hope. It was a very moving moment. And the following weekend, we were going to see our very close friend, now deceased, alas, Frank Kermode in Cambridge, eminent literary critic. And he was interested, this man. I told him the story. And I said to Frank, is there any poem you can't read without choking up? And he said, go and get the Larkin. So I went and got the Larkin. And there's a Larkin poem, it's in the book, called Unfinished Poem, which doesn't mean the poem's unfinished, it means the subject matter's unfinished. And it's pretty brutally about death treading its way up the stairs to this narrator who's alone in an attic. And death turns out to be a pretty young girl with bare feet who does a dance for him. And the punchline, as it were, of the poem is him saying, his last gasp, what summer have you broken from? To death. And Frank couldn't get that line out. And so I thought, my God, there's a book in this. There's an anthology called Poems Make Strong Men Cry, is what I was going to call it. And for months I went around asking everybody, male and vaguely literary and sometimes not, that I met. And it was amazing how many of them said, yes, this one, immediately. And then, of course, I got distracted by other things and forgot about it. And then about 3 and a bit years ago, my son Ben got in touch with me and said, Dad, let's do that book together.
We were in touch at the time. But yeah. Sounds like
indeed, yes.
Estranged.
A remote dad.
But Ben, in your household, were you conscious when you grew up? Was your father sort of over your shoulder, poetry this, poetry that?
No, not poetry this, poetry that, but Mum, who's here as well, and Dad. Certainly I was surrounded by poetry as well as music and other literature and other art. So it was never an issue or a question in terms of enjoying it. And then over time I discovered different poetry at different times in my life. And that's sort of reflected in the book in terms of the ages. We have people in their 20s to their 80s, some, alas, have passed away, like Frank and Seamus Heaney choosing poems. But I think you can chart different times of life in the book. And also in emotional responses. Andrew Motion makes the point, as do others, but Andrew Motion says he finds himself crying more as he gets older, and Dad almost just started weeping. I don't cry all that much, or that easily, but I cry more now I've had children. And I've found with this idea, there was something very special about it, I thought, hence why I called Dad and said, why don't we have a go at this, making it into a book after all those years, because it stayed with me. I think then I started looking into tears to try and understand why this was a good concept, because I love the title, but I'm not a scientist, but I wanted to understand a little bit more about crying, and found out some really interesting things. I found Darwin's quote that crying is that special expression of man's, and that we're the only species that cry through emotion. Some have picked me up on this and say, well, elephants cry too, but perhaps that's the case. But Darwin certainly felt that we were the only species that cried when stress overcomes us. And it's a very natural, very healthy cleansing, hormonally, of the bloodstream. So the substance that comes out of your eyes when you cry through emotion is actually different chemically to the tears that wind blasting in your face or outside if it's cold you might emit walking across the bridge on your way home. So these were fascinating insights, but also the fact that from around the age of 10, it's statistically proven, and it won't be a huge revelation to everyone, that boys cry less. And I don't know why that is, how much of it's biological. Probably, I think most of it is culturally. And as the father, my wife's also here, as parents of boy-girl twins who are 7, and our son was actually crying in the middle of the night last night, I can guarantee they cry equally. I think it's sad.
Was he reading poetry in the middle of the night?
Yeah, Larkin. I think it's sad, but also, relevant to being a man and some of the gender issues raised in this this weekend, but also the book. That's not healthy. As you said, poetry in Ireland, you might be accepted a little bit more reading a poem. Crying also is something that we shy away from showing to other people. It obviously shows vulnerability, and it's also thought to be perhaps some sort of distress signal, obviously a mammalian distress signal. So something we don't necessarily want others to see, and that's perfectly natural. At the same time, to repress those tears or suppress those tears can't be healthy if it's something that's being forbidden or not allowed or not sanctioned in some way. And Amnesty are our partners on the book, and they make, Kate Allen has a very erudite view on this, but also the Samaritans represented here and a part of this weekend, and male suicide is the biggest killer of men under 40 in this country. And I think, again, I'm not making too sort of grandiose claims, but that little statistic about a boy crying less and that big statistic about men dying.
So let's
I just think, these are the sorts of conversations that the book throws up. And
I think the other interesting thing is, historically, in Elizabethan England, it was very respectable. It was genteel to keep a lace handkerchief in your top pocket and dab your eyes every so often in conversation. And I think the same was true for most of Victorian England until the days of empire. And I think this, our slogan for the book became, we're out to abolish the British stiff upper lip. Yeah. And I think the concept of stiff upper lip really dates back to empire and manhood and all that. And
so you think before we began to conquer the world, it was fine to cry, but once we started conquering the world, we didn't want to show our weakness.
Teaching these chappies how to behave, yes.
Well, Ben, how about getting us started with a
Sure.
poem that makes you misty-eyed?
Sure. Well, I'm going to borrow from the book, obviously, so
of course.
It's not just me that it makes misty-eyed. And Melvin Bragg, in his introduction, the other thing about the book, which we slightly stumbled upon, is that 100 men are choosing a poem that they can't read without crying, but they're also explaining why. And so sometimes poetry might feel like a challenge, or it might require a certain level of application, depending on who you are, to pick up a piece of poetry or a book and think, right, I'm going to read myself a poem. However, if you have William or any of the 99 other brilliant men leading you by the hand into the poem, you can't help but then read it. So we slightly stumbled upon that, but I think that is another distinguishing feature of the book. So Melvin, in his introduction, says that the poem he chose, which is a Shakespeare sonnet, speaks as directly to me over the centuries as any evening's call from a close friend. Now, Richard Curtis chose a poem by Seamus Heaney called A Call. And I'll read you Richard's introduction to the poem, and then I'll read you the poem itself. Richard, of course, the writer of Four Weddings and a Funeral, and I think when we gather for moments of high emotion like weddings and funerals, those are generally the times you will hear a poem in your lives, over the course of the year, for instance. This is his introduction. As my father grew older, I noticed that he rarely came close to shedding tears about the sad and serious things in our lives. But if ever telling a tale of something good, some gracious or loving piece of behaviour, tears would always come into his eyes. And I feel myself going that way as I too get older. Sadness somehow I expect. Kindness and love take me by surprise. So I love this poem with its bold and unexpected simple statement of love in the final line. It also moves me because I've always presumed it is a poem about a friend, and I have failed my friends mainly, and failed to fulfill the potential of my friendships, allowing the other big things in my life to edge them out. So it's also very much a poem about my life, and the fact that the author almost says I love you, but doesn't. Well, there's the sadness in it, after all. A call. Hold on, she said, I'll just run out and get him. The weather here's so good, he took the chance to do a bit of weeding. So I saw him, down on his hands and knees beside the leak rig, touching, inspecting, separating one stalk from the other, gently pulling up everything not tapered, frail and leafless, pleased to feel each little weed root break, but rueful also. Then found myself listening to the amplified, grave ticking of hall clocks where the phone lay unattended in a calm of mirror glass and sunstruck pendulums. And found myself then thinking, if it were nowadays, this is how death would summon every man. Next thing he spoke, and I nearly said I loved him. So again, the fact that he nearly says he loves him, as Richard identifies, is the sort of reaching sadness of it.
And Richard Curtis did something rather remarkable. If you remember that film, Four Weddings and a Funeral, Faber soon after thought they would exploit the popularity of it, and they published a very slim volume of W.H. Auden's verse. I think it had 12 of his poems in it. And over the next year, more copies of that book were sold than in the entire lifetime of W.H. Auden of his poetry. And that gives you an idea. I think the key is context. And Ben gave you good context there before he read that. And I think my pharmacy example I was bringing up a bit early on is all about context. And I think part of the problem for people is the word poetry. It has this image of a sort of back of a bookshop, dusty, slim, elite volume of something that's inaccessible. And yet actually, poetry is tremendously prevalent in our lives, but what we're not necessarily aware of, because we take it for granted, that it actually is poetry. I mean, a good example would be, if you read the words to You'll Never Walk Alone, which was written by Oscar Hammerstein for a musical, which are chanted by I don't know how many people on the terraces of Liverpool. It's a beautiful piece of poetry. But again, if I stood outside the COP on a Saturday afternoon at 5:55 and said, love that poem you're all chanting, I may not make it home, you know. Similarly, I think we're a nation which is obsessed by poetry. It's in our jingles. It's in our greetings cards. You know, we may be snooty about greetings cards. We buy more greetings cards in Britain than any other culture. And I met one of the people who's made a fortune out of publishing them, because they're very expensive, aren't they? Anyway, and he said to me that he's got one person who writes poems, as he calls them, in his greetings card, and if he writes them, he can sell 100,000 copies. of that card. Right. And he said no one else can stand up to him. I can sell 20, 30, but when John does it, he's the man. He's probably Britain's best-selling poet. But, in that sense, similarly, poetry in the 19th century was incredibly big in Britain. When Tennyson's latest volume of verse came out, people queued to buy a copy of it, because actually in that era it was very hard to consume culture. If you wanted to hear an orchestra, you'd had to move to a big town or a city to even hear that kind of music. If you wanted to see a new painting, it would be a big deal to go to a big exhibition and so forth. Most people couldn't afford books, they were too expensive and so forth. So actually poetry had a really powerful, resonant role in the nation's cultural life. I think it's still here today, but it's subsumed into lots of other things. Rap music, which broke through in the early 80s and has been the most significant music really for the last 30 years, is filled with the most incredible poetry. It's all around us, but we're perhaps not quite sure what it really is. Anthony?
Just picking up on Four Weddings and a Funeral, Stop All the Clocks, Auden's Funeral Blues, it's called, isn't it? Simon Callow, who is the guy in the coffin, as that's being read, I tried rather sneakily to persuade him to choose that for this volume, and he actually chose another Auden poem, but he mentions it in his introduction. And just so you know, Simon was hoping to be here with us today to read properly for us, but alas, his filming commitments have stopped him. I had an email this morning sending everybody his greetings.
Well, why don't you read us a poem from the anthology, not one that obviously you've selected, but one that somebody else has selected, yes, that's made you a bit misty-eyed too.
Well, there's a poem that's been chosen by Ken Loach, the film director. It's by John Clare, early 19th century Northamptonshire poet, written when he was confined to a lunatic asylum. And for me, it's one of the most desolate poems in the language. And none of us wants this session to get too gloomy, so I've got a really funny one for you later on that we'll all get a laugh out of. But meanwhile, Ken Loach runs through the other poems he might have chosen, Wilfred Owen, Goethe, Shelley, etc. And then he says, John Clare wrote of the countryside with great affection, but spent his last years in an asylum. This poem tells of a man reduced to nothingness, bereft, abandoned, beyond tears. The desperation of Clare's words leaves you weeping for all who share his plight. I am, yet what I am, none cares or knows. My friends forsake me like a memory lost. I am the self-consumer of my woes. They rise and vanish in oblivion's host, like shades in love and death's oblivion lost. And yet I am, and live with shadows tossed into the nothingness of scorn and noise, into the living sea of waking dreams, when there is neither sense of life nor joys, but the vast shipwreck of my life's esteems. And e'en the dearest that I loved the best are strange, nay, rather stranger than the rest. I long for scenes where man hath never trod, a place where woman never smiled or wept, there to abide with my Creator, God, and sleep as I in childhood sweetly slept, untroubling and untroubled where I lie, the grass below, above the vaulted sky. Doesn't get much worse than that. Yeah.
Now, I'm intrigued because looking at the book, on the whole, men have chosen men's poetry, haven't they?
This may be the moment to say that we've just this week delivered the sequel, Poems That Make Grown Women Cry. And very interesting comparisons to be made, but you're quite right. Of these almost 100 poems, only a dozen are by women. In the female volume, you'll not be surprised to know there are slightly more by women, chosen by the women. 24, in fact, which...
Only 24 out of 100.
Well, it goes to show that I guess there have been huge tranches of literary history when women were not published as poets.
Before 1850, basically.
Yeah, there aren't so many female written poems available.
And accordingly, I think another thing, we're still figuring out quite the character of the new volume, but it skews slightly more contemporary and modern. interestingly as well.
Why, do you think?
Well, again,
Is it that women read contemporary verse and most of the blokes you've spoken to haven't opened or bought a new book of poetry in their adult
But
lives?
75% of the male book is 20th century.
Yeah.
I'm wary of making too many generalizations. But I think, again, the fact that there's doubled the number of female poets and it's also skewing slightly more modern, perhaps that's partly why.
Yeah.
Partly.
Yeah.
Are you going to
some interesting overlaps where eminent women have chosen the same poems as some of the eminent men.
Yes.
We'll probably keep our secret for now. Late February it's coming out, just in time for Mother's Day. It's coming out.
And you'll read.
Well, I was going to actually just pick this up for a moment because 2 weeks ago, exactly 2 weeks ago, I was doing just this sort of thing, but it was a conference in Dublin on conflict mediation, which is another sort of part of my life. And we were all really in recovery from what had happened the night before in Paris. And we were supposed to be talking about conflict mediation or conflict resolution, but it was at a time of such extreme and damaging conflict the night before that we felt we had to sort of change the theme of the conversation that we were having. And somebody said to me, will you close off with a poem that you thought might be relevant to the situation? And we had blown up on the screen behind us the Mail on Sunday's front page, which was basically that 2 of the terrorists from the night before had come as refugees via boats through Greece. And I think we were all extremely anxious about what the impact was going to be on all kinds of people in Britain. And so I chose this. And it's written by John Donne. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee.
Astonishingly, there's no John Donne. None of the metaphysical poets, to me astonishingly, Marvell, Herbert, in the male book. I think there are 1 or 2 in the female. And this may be the time to cheer us all up a bit.
I think so.
Thanks to our partnership with Amnesty, we have some really extraordinary contributors, including a Malawian-born man called Jack Mapanje, who was persecuted and escaped under Hastings Banda, and now I think lives in this country, teaches English at York. He chose a poem by Bertolt Brecht, which makes him cry with laughter. And it's about books being banned, a grim subject, but it's the poet is complaining, why haven't you banned my books? That's what I love about it. It's called The Book Burnings. When the regime ordered that books with harmful knowledge should be publicly burnt, and all around oxen were forced to drag cartloads of books to the pyre, one banished poet, one of the best, discovered, studying the list of the burnt, to his horror, that his books had been forgotten. He hurried to his desk on wings of rage and wrote a letter to the powers that be. "Burn me," he wrote, his pen flying. "Burn me. Don't do this to me. Don't pass me over. Have I not always told the truth in my books? And now I am being treated by you as a liar? I order you, burn me." I love that.
That changed the pace very nicely. Thank you very much. And what about you? Is there anything in the book that doesn't make you cry but delights you?
There's loads. There's something in it for absolutely everyone, I think. And there is a lot of humour in here. If there's one theme, perhaps, that unites the poems, there's a sense of loss. So that can take all sorts of different forms, from the summer.
But I think that's a very important point. I think that people turn to poetry in times of need. I don't know whether you feel that, but it struck me that loss is often the reason why we look at a poem, often to do with grief.
Well, we
loss
have
of parents.
two men in the book who've lost a child.
Three.
Yeah,
Three,
lost a child.
Yeah.
Three, sorry.
Loss of a love.
And I sort of emerged from the experience of doing this with the sense that one of the most common, I don't know what the word is, appeals of poetry, or the echo that it strikes with people, is a sense of yearning. Often, especially as you grow older, which Ben's talked about, at missed opportunities of some. But people yearning for something, and obviously I think loss comes into that category, yearning for a missed loved one. And we've had, we had a very good response at the time, but since the book's come out, we've had some very moving letters from people who've been bereaved, often in tragic circumstances, saying that the book has brought them consolation.
I think I get more requests every year from people saying, my mum's died, my father's died, or whatever, I'm having a funeral and can you help me find a poem for that? That often is a reference point for people with poetry. But I think it's important to be uplifted by poetry and inspired by poetry. So come on.
Agreed.
Come on, Ben, cheer us up.
I'll try. I think this is quite fun. It's chosen by the film director Tom McCarthy, who's got this incredible film I just saw about to come out called Spotlight, which I think you should all go and see when it does arrive. But he also made The Station Agent, The Visitor, and he was also in The Wire, so he's a pretty clever, talented guy. And he chose a poem called A Poetry Reading at West Point, West Point being the preeminent military academy in the US. So again, it's a military-themed story. I'm not going to do an American accent, sorry, especially not in front of my wife,
right.
who'll take the mickey out of me later. So I'll read the poem. How about I read the poem and then I'll read the introduction, so I'll flip them. A Poetry Reading at West Point. I read to the entire plebe class in 2 batches, twice the hall filled with bodies dressed alike, each toting a copy of my book. What would my shrink say, if I had one, about such a dream, if it were a dream? Question and answer time. Sir, a cadet yelled from the balcony and gave his name and rank, and then, closing his parentheses, yelled, Sir, again. Why do your poems give me a headache when I try to understand them? He asked. Do you want that? I have a gift for gentle jokes to diffuse tension, but this was not the time to use it. I try to write as well as I can what it feels like to be human. I started, picking my way carefully, for he and I were, after all, pained by the same dumb longings. I try to say what I don't know how to say, but of course I can't get much of it down at all. By now I was sweating bullets. I don't want my poems to be hard unless the truth is, if there is a truth. Silence hung in the hall like a heavy fabric. My own head ached. Sir, he yelled. Thank you, sir. I'll read you Tom's introduction. My wife, who's also a poet, introduced me to this poem. She knows poems and she knows me. Of course it moved me. How could it not? The idea of how people struggle to connect with art also deeply resonates with me, and how the artist struggles to connect with his audience and remain true to, well, the truth. Regardless of the side you play, citizen or artist, the need to reach out, to connect, to feel, and to affect is so satisfying and so elusive. The process is awkward, moving, funny, clumsy, desperate, and occasionally wondrous. It's essentially human. Sir, thank you, sir, straight to my heart.
I try to say what I want to say. That intrigues me because I think this comes again to a little bit of the root of why we seek out poetry, to help say the things we want to say, but don't necessarily have the language or vocabulary.
Which I do think, again, just because it's being a man, is so especially key for men.
Isn't it?
Because we know, as
Isn't
again,
it?
the Samaritans, we know that, going back to the suicide rate, etc., men are not as ready always to talk about their feelings. Again, that's partly why I chose that poem, West Point, of all places, for a poetry reading, the collision of that West Point culture and a poetry reading.
I think that's very, very
really interesting.
Very helpful. I'm going to develop that thought a little further, because my poem, the poem that makes me cry, and I'm going to read to you now, and hopefully I won't sob all the way through, is relevant for just that reason. Philip Larkin had an amazing ability to write about things that are otherwise, about thoughts that we would push out of our minds. He wrote about some of the most disturbing things that we think about, but normally would try and exclude in a way. And the poem I'm going to read to you, it was written quite late in his life, and it's written about lying awake at night and worrying about dying, which is something that is a universal experience. And yet he writes his poems in such a way that they're not full of show-offy, elegant variation. They're completely accessible. Everybody can understand what he's going on about. But he, as I say, he holds on to moments of sometimes complete terror and horror and explores them. And in that way becomes incredibly universal and incredibly powerful. And this is a poem by Larkin called Obeyed, which is French for dawn or dawning. I work all day and get half drunk at night. Waking at 4 to soundless dark, I stare. In time the curtain edges will grow light. Till then, I see what's really always there. Unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible. But how and where and when I shall myself die? Arid interrogation. Yet the fear of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. The mind blanks at the glare, not in remorse, the good not done, the love not given, time torn off unused. Nor wretchedly, because an only life can take so long to climb clear of its wrong beginnings, and may never. But at the total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to, and shall be lost in, always, not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon. Nothing more terrible, nothing more true. This is a special way of being afraid. No trick dispels. Religion used to try, that vast, moth-eaten musical brocade created to pretend we never die. And specious stuff that says no man can fear a thing he cannot feel, not seeing that this is what we fear. No sight, no touch, no sound, no smell, nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with, the anesthetic from which none come round. And so it stays, just on the edge of vision, a small, unfocused blur, a standing chill which slows each impulse down to indecision. Most things may never happen. This one will. And realization of it rages out in furnace fear when we're caught without people or drink. Courage is no good. It means not scaring others. Being brave lets no one off the grave. Death is no different whined at than withstood. Slowly light strengthens and the room takes shape. It stands plain as a wardrobe. What we know, have always known, know that we can't escape, yet can't accept. One side will have to go. Meanwhile, telephones crouch, getting ready to ring in locked-up offices, and all the intricate, uncaring, rented world begins to rouse. The sky is white as clay with no sun. Work has to be done. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house. And just so you don't go out on a gloom, I'm going to read you one of the shortest poems in the book by Siegfried Sassoon, who probably is always associated with writing poems that really do make you probably not want to come out of a black cupboard again. But here is a rather wondrous piece of poetry called Everyone Sang. Everyone suddenly burst out singing, and I was filled with such delight as prisoned birds must find in freedom, winging wildly across the white orchards and dark green fields, on, and out of sight. Everyone's voice was suddenly lifted, and beauty came like the setting sun. My heart was shaken with tears, and horror drifted away. Oh, but everyone was a bird, and the song was wordless, and the singing will never be done. Thank you very much indeed.